Good morning. Thank you for coming out this morning. I'd like to thank my former student and now colleague, Andres Chavez, and Ciim-Uide's president, Aldo Maino, along with all of the Ciim-Uide colleagues and friends for inviting me to speak here. I'm delighted to be here in Ecuador. And for the first time ever to be in this school and also in this country, I've found Ecuador incredibly warm and the people very generous. So it's really a privilege to be here. And I'm excited to share some thoughts with you this morning. But first, let me share some thoughts about Northeastern, where I come from. For over 100 years, Northeastern's been a leader in experiential learning, starting as an engineering school for upskilling factory workers and housed in the YMCA in Boston. It's now a truly global university. Students engage in experiential learning opportunities in 131 countries on all 7 continents, which is a 128% increase since 2006. So we're growing very quickly. The number of international students has increased by 353% in that time as well, with international undergraduate enrollment rising from 4% to 19%. In 2012, Northeastern received a $60 million gift from 2 alums to create the DeMoore McKim School of Business, which is where I work. It has increased its faculty by 25% and experienced a 34% rise in faculty member publications in top journals. Global learning opportunities for business students include entrepreneurship education through something called the Co-op program, where students spend 6 months every year of their undergraduate degree in a job, in a salaried paid job, in an industry of their interest that Northeastern helps to match them. And so by the time that they graduate from undergraduate, students at Northeastern have had up to 2 to 3 6 months work experience on their resume. Northeastern's global network continues to grow. There are more than 230,000 alums in 186 countries. The university partners with nearly 3,200 co-op employers around the globe. And earlier this year, Northeastern announced its first international campus in Toronto and its first annex campus in Silicon Valley. So where I sit at Northeastern in the Social Enterprise Institute, which is a small student-focused organization out of the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Group at the business school, I'm one of 4 change leaders at Northeastern's campus. What does that mean? It means that the international nonprofit Ashoka has recognized Northeastern as one of 34 leading campuses in social innovation education around the world. As change leaders, my colleagues in the law school, social sciences, and the Social Justice Resource Center work across disciplines, like this conference, through collaborative research, teaching, and co-curricular programming to really create opportunities for social change making for students in every aspect of their student life. We work with students, faculty, community partners, funders, institutions, and governments to make sure students find a social purpose-driven experience when they're in college. I share this to illustrate how social entrepreneurship as a field is not just about enterprising businesses for social good. In fact, it serves as a discursive bridge that connects humanities with natural and social sciences. It embeds human values and social purpose into evidence-based research and teaching. It shows students there are many ways to create social change, whether they be the explorer, inspiring the vision and setting the course, whether they be the gardener, the creative condition-setting enabler where ideas can grow, or the coach, offering guidance in the journey towards uncertain outcomes with hope and ambition amidst increasing ambiguity. Society needs all of these change makers in different roles. And in these turbulent times, we need change makers more than ever. So my remarks will be divided into 4 parts. I'd like to make the case first that even though it doesn't need much fuel these days, we need alternative business models. We need models that seek sustainability writ large. The second point, I'd like to provide a very brief overview of social entrepreneurship as a concept and a praxis in relation to entrepreneurship, which is a focus of your school, with a specific focus on considerations for emerging economies like Ecuador. And then I'd like to present several examples of social enterprise models that I think are worth emulating. And then I'd point out, finally, how we finance these social enterprises and social change in general, and then what challenges lie ahead as scholars, students, administrators, and citizens in the global economy. Oops. So why sustainable business? Why social entrepreneurship? What social enterprise models work? How to finance it, and challenges ahead. The 2008 financial crisis, if we did a word cloud in Google, the things that would pop up are things like risk, disaster, things that most of us would shy away from: warning, breakdown, distrust. The 2008 financial crisis was the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. It displaced millions of people. What was it caused by? It was not caused by not enforcing rules. It was caused by people disobeying them. It was caused by a lack of trust. It was caused by pure greed. It was caused by a lack of values. And it created an incredible tide of reflection that all of us had to have, and Wall Street around the world, of what are we doing? What is the role of business in society? If you look very simply, I'm going to show you a couple graphs of rising household income volatility. We look at just around the world, our sense of security is not what it used to be. Most families in most low-income countries live on the precipice. Just look at the global youth unemployment statistics. You look at sub-Saharan Africa, you look at parts of South Asia, you look at even in the United States, and we have an amazing amount of unemployment, and it's only getting worse. There's a lot of parts of the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, that have not stopped growing. The population curve is still mounting, which means that we're going to have at least half of the population under 25. What does that mean for security? What does that mean for ideas of opportunity? Where does entrepreneurship and other types of ideas and concepts and supposed solutions fit into these dynamics? Another really alarming factor, and my colleague spoke about this yesterday, is the distrust in our institutions. Doesn't surprise anyone after 2008 why we would distrust our institutions, our banks, our governments, even our NGOs. Are we getting the information that we need? Is that information factual? Can we trust it? The significant divide between those that are informed and those that are not, and then even those informed don't act. And then the last important point is, if we want to change the world for the better and create opportunities for everyone in Ecuador, in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, around the world, then we need to spread a little bit more the wealth. We need to figure out where the venture capital is actually going and why it isn't going to some places. As you can see by this graph, it's pretty centralized in parts of the world that make a lot of sense, but are also troubling. Because if we think of things like entrepreneurship as a vehicle for growth in an economy, then how do we attract the capital that entrepreneurship needs? I'm a big fan of questions, and there's a big question in social entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship literature in general. And this big question is, can one be an active participant in a capitalist society and also live ethically? What evidence is there that social entrepreneurship, this idea of businesses with a social heart, with a purpose, provide a real path towards reconciling these ideas of growth, economic growth in an economy or even in a firm, and sustainability? Social entrepreneurship as a concept in scholarly literature was really confirmed by the late Greg Dees. Gregory Dees was a fantastic professor and researcher at Stanford, and then the last place he was at was Duke, where he started in the business school a really important program. And Greg was really committed to this idea of an open innovation society, a society where information is actually a public good. And social enterprises and entrepreneurs, their mission is to make sure that that information of good ideas gets out there as quickly as possible so everyone can benefit from them. So as he says here, people of all walks of life are applying their creativity and entrepreneurial talents to mobilizing resources, identifying opportunities, and crafting innovative solutions. That's the heart of what we define as entrepreneurship. Resources, opportunities, solutions. By increasing their impact, social entrepreneurs create new incentives. This is an important point, because part of the reason 2008 happened is we had perverse incentives, people getting rewarded for doing things that were unethical. So how do we create new incentives to encourage the development of decentralized decision-making processes, where we start to democratize systems like finance, and people have opportunities themselves to take it into their own hands and to create the world that they want? Just a quick look at Ashoka Fellows, the social entrepreneurship organization that's global. You have 31 outstanding people in Ecuador doing phenomenal things. And I just skimmed through them, and I'd like to highlight 3 of them as examples of people that are taking personal risk with imagination and entrepreneurial skills to bring much needed services and ideas to the population in Ecuador. Cesar Cadenas, looking at this idea of civic engagement. As you know, in the United States, we need a lot more of that. I think in Ecuador you do too. Finding ways of people participating in the democracy. Marta Echaviara, excuse my Spanish, thinking about upstream and downstream users and how people can access different types of resources in sustainable ways. As you know, in Ecuador particularly, conservation of the natural world is directly linked to economic development. Our resources are not unlimited. It's a gift and a stewardship responsibility. And then Oswaldo Granda Perez, which is a really interesting, amazing organization that really looks at the connection between urban life and growth and sustainability. I invite you to look at the Ashoka Fellows and many others in Ecuador that are really making the difference between just sitting by and accepting the status quo and challenging the status quo with a vision for a better future. What is a social enterprise exactly? What are the characteristics that we think of? Well, the first is, it is an enterprise. So an enterprise approach means that, of course, we're looking at market principles, entrepreneurial activities, and general business approaches, which means that we are managing things and resources. We're interested in making sure that what comes in and comes out is recorded and is balanced, and we have a sustainable strategy of income. There are social aims in the social enterprise. What distinguishes a social enterprise from a regular company is mission. A social enterprise goes into business with a social mission. That's very different than a business going in to, for example, create a very cool gadget and just happens to be a gadget that people in some other poor community uses. That's different. Going in with a social mission, crafting a tool or an idea or a service with the intention of actually correcting a market failure or a state failure is what social enterprises seek to do. In that, they create value where the market wasn't valuing these ideas or these activities. But we're also agnostic about legal form. And why? Because every part of the world is different. And what a social enterprise looks like in Italy, the very first country to actually have a legal form of empresa social, will look very, very different than social enterprises in Ecuador. In the United States, we have wonderful new legislation for different types of social enterprises. In other countries, like the UK, in Sweden, they're very different. So we have to be agnostic about what legal form, LLC, what firm structure a social enterprise takes. What we're interested in is the mission, the social mission, the commitment to values in the process of creating the product or service, and then how that product or service has an impact on the population. But still, why the social? Can't we do all of that and still call it entrepreneurship? Why don't we just embed the values into this idea of entrepreneurship? Why do we have to put social before it? There's a lot of debate between academics and practitioners on the need for this. And I'd like to just point your attention to the idea that there's a lot of dichotomies that we create in our minds and in literature based on assumptions that we've had about how society works. And one of them is this concept that social value is somehow different than individual value. And we forget that we're all embedded in societies and communities, and that markets themselves are embedded in communities. And so social entrepreneurship says there's a false dichotomy here, that social value and individual value are actually inextricably linked, and that what we do for ourselves, we have to think about the impacts of the society. Formal and informal is another one. A lot of the informal economy is the most productive in low-income countries, and yet they're very structured. They're very formal, actually, in their informality. There are rules, even if they're tacit rules, and there's a lot of predictability in some ways in the informal economy. Again, market and social milieus overlap, competition and cooperation. This idea of co-opetition, that you actually need cooperation for healthy competition. And that some competition is very helpful to you, but if ultimately you're not cooperating with ideas and information towards shared goals, the competition doesn't serve you. Other types of dichotomies that we try to unpack and understand and critically examine, but one of the biggest ones is impact and profit. There's an assumption in modern portfolio theory and in business of maximizing profits, which means that you can't also think about the social dividends or social subsidies that are required to accomplish public goods, deliver public goods. And that those externalities have to be accounted for outside of a company. Social enterprises turn that upside down. And they say, no, absolutely not. That in some ways what's incredibly important is if you're going for sustainable business, if you want your business to be successful, that means into the future sustaining itself, then without taking into consideration the social and environmental issues that are involved in making the business sustainable, you actually aren't strategic. And so to be strategic, you embed those into the actual business. So those are just some ideas of why the social is important, but ultimately the social is important because we still have enormous amounts of social problems, and the traditional business structures have not rallied to solve them. And we need, until the world is a better place, until businesses themselves are serving human values and human prosperity, we will need the social until we have a better outcome. Let me give you just an idea here of some starting points in the academic literature. Social entrepreneurship is transdisciplinary. What do we mean by that? It's not just multidisciplinary. It's not just multidisciplinary, it's transdisciplinary, which is why this idea of the talk that I'm giving today is a discursive bridge. Because it actually transcends economics, sociology, anthropology. It relies on all of these disciplines in order for it to weave together the conceptual foundations for what we talk about in social entrepreneurship literature. It pulls on Adam Smith. Everyone knows who Adam Smith is. Wealth of Nations, the father of economics, some call him. He also wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is a really important book, and actually, to Adam Smith, his more important book. It was the book that he started and the book that he ended his life with. And the Theory of Moral Sentiments is a really interesting book because it's his moral philosophy of what economics should be. And in it, he mentions the word love 45 times. And he mentions the word self-interest in The Wealth of Nations once. Why? So why do we talk about self-interest and not love? Adam Smith wouldn't be too excited about that. He wants us to look at his work and think about what he was trying to say. What he's trying to say is the concept of self-interest is actually embedded in the idea of how we see each other. We can't look at ourselves without also looking at each other. So this idea of self-regarding behavior is determined by how we see others, other-regarding behavior. So when we think about self-interest, we want to incorporate a good reading of Adam Smith, which actually challenges us to go beyond the limited view of self-interest that we are told is critical for competitive business and economics. And then, of course, Joseph Schumpeter. The ideas behind entrepreneurship very much were pinned by him in a really important book where he talks about the interplay between democracy and markets and society. So if you look at all of these important authors, Peter Drucker, management guru from Harvard Business School, and you look at their philosophies of where they see these interconnections, they look at the fact that we can't separate economics and finance from the world's dynamics, which are human. They're complex and they're social. And we need to find ways and ideas and conceptual frameworks to help us navigate that better. So in History, Research, and Practice, social entrepreneurship says, let's learn from cooperative movements. In Latin America, you have enormous history of cooperative movements, producer cooperatives, worker cooperatives. We have a lot to learn from in different areas of the gift economy, what they are now calling the sharing economy. There's a lot of incredible, very local, indigenous, and old models of social economy in Ecuador, in Latin America. What do we know about them? How can we use some of these lessons to inform us to make better businesses that address the challenges of the 21st century? We've come a long way. We've come a very long way. If you think about where we've started, in the 1980s with Reagan and Thatcher, most of you were alive? Not sure. No, we're not alive. So yeah, Reagan and Thatcher, President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher from the UK, Reagan being our American Hollywood president, they decided that new public management, it's a concept called new public management. It was this idea that government is in and of itself inefficient. Private sector is more efficient because it's profit maximizing, and therefore if we adopt some of those profit maximizing ideas to government, we'll have better government. Makes sense? Except that it's not true. Government has been incredibly efficient in a lot of areas, more efficient than a lot of companies, which the majority of them fail. And so what we ended up with was this thriving thrust towards efficiency and results, and at the same time, a cutting of most social services and an outsourcing of a lot of that and privatization of a lot of government services. That started a trend, and what that created was a gap, this gap here. I don't know if you can see the slide so well. It created a gap which actually was one of the driving forces for the creation of social enterprises. We needed better ways to deliver services that the government was no longer delivering. And so where the financial sector was pretty clear in what they were concerned with, and traditionally the government and civil society was concerned with their areas, the stuff that didn't have a market and a price tag on it, all of a sudden social enterprises said, these services need to be delivered, we need to make money doing them, and how do we do it in interesting, creative ways where people will actually pay for the things because what they're getting is good, not because they just need it. They're actually getting good services and good products from the social sector. And as we see now, where we are into the future, there's really exciting trends on how civil society has found creative ways of marshaling very traditionally exclusive sectors like finance into more inclusive models of participatory development. But still, why not just entrepreneurship? So as you can see, I'm trying to make a case to you all today. All of you entrepreneurship. Can I just have a raise of hands of how many are in the entrepreneurship department or field here studying it? Okay. A couple of you, 3 of you, 4 of you. Okay. Part of the reason is because there's this deliberate set of actions to achieve social outcomes, and that social risk is something we don't think about, and we need to. In economics, we think about it a lot. We think about environmental risk, and we calculate for it. But we don't think about social risk. What's the risk of not doing something? Yesterday, we had a wonderful workshop, and a lot of the students and colleagues in the room talked about the risk of not protecting women in public transportation. They talked about the social risk of not protecting the environment. They came up with fantastic solutions. And so social entrepreneurship is a point of entry and an excuse and a reason and a dialogue where we can actually have those conversations and think about really exciting creative solutions to solve them. Some common mistakes I'd like to highlight in applying private sector approaches to human development. We tend to confuse often what low-income customers or suppliers need with what they actually want. So in business school, we think about what products are going to be competitive given market analysis and niche opportunities. But what we forget about is actually what people will be able to pay for, given, particularly now in a lot of parts of the world, very tight pocketbooks. So what will they actually pay for? Willingness to pay. But how do we design things that actually solve their needs in ways that they want to pay for them, where they can do so in a responsible and ethical way to balance other priorities? Real scale of social enterprises, of any type of enterprise that seeks to change the world in a positive way, deliver something to the excluded, solve a market problem, they're not quick fixes. They take a long time. Change in society takes a long time. You've probably walked down a sidewalk and seen a pothole and wondered, whose job is it? And why is it still there? And then a year later, you realize that the pothole's been filled with garbage and other things, and nature inertia just takes over. Social enterprise, like most social change, is involving human beings, and human beings are complex. And so if you want these businesses to thrive, you have to be patient. They take a long time. And as a result, we need to think about what social change and social impact should be measured against. And then finally, knowing the appropriate model for the context. It's not always self-evident. We think, for example, that you know Ecuador. You think you know your city. You think you know your community. But do you really? How many different people have you spoken to? What do you know about the lives of the people that live in the poorest part of the city? Have you spent any time drinking limonata with them? What do you really know? So the power of observation, of engagement, of understanding different people's realities, social enterprise and social entrepreneurship literature spends a lot of time talking about that. How do we do that better? How do we find context-specific solutions that will therefore be more sustainable? Because they come from the people themselves. Social entrepreneurs are interesting characters. On the Ashoka Fellows website that I invited you to visit, where the 31 Ecuadorian fellows are listed, as you'll see, most of them are people that have very deep connections to their communities. But social entrepreneurs also need some basic skills. And it doesn't mean they have to have all of them. We have teams. We thrive on teams. But you still need to have tenacity and an ability to tell your story. You need to have this idea of hustle, that when the chips are down and you have no resources, that you galvanize your will and make it happen. And then I think one characteristic that's very important of social entrepreneurs is when everyone else laughs at them and says no, they take that as a challenge to do it. Social value creation processes are cyclical, nonlinear, and they mostly start with identifying a social problem. But sometimes you don't have to identify it, like the 2008 financial crisis. And there's so many wonderful innovations that have come out of that financial crisis in the world. But they start with identifying social problems, mobilizing resources, looking at how do we do high-cost employment? And you're probably scratching your head. Why would we want high-cost employment? We want low-cost employment. Social enterprises want high-cost employment because they see human capital. Social enterprises value human capital as the most essential component to the business model. People. They want to put more money into making sure that their employees are paid well and that they're protected and that they're growing and that eventually maybe they grow out of the company. That's what they're interested in. They look at the idea of ecological footprint as a critically important component, making sure that their impact is responsible, and inclusive distribution. Social enterprises, if they're producing something that the population needs, they want to make sure the whole population has access to it. And then this idea of open innovation, where most firms want to keep their knowledge very tight to themselves. Social enterprises want it to get into the water. They want it to go everywhere. They want to spread the good stuff because it's about transforming society, not about increasing the value of the firm. So finally, another big question. How do social enterprises facilitate better access to markets and better deliver public goods? Well, this is where this concept of hybrid business models comes in. What is a hybrid business model? And when you think of a hybridity, it's taking something from somewhere and putting it into something else, right? We talk about that often in agriculture with trees. You're grafting a branch onto another tree and it grows and becomes part of that tree. Hybrid organizations are very similar. When you take something, for example, like a for-profit model and marry it with a non-profit model, those are hybrid organizations. I'm going to give you an example of one that I really like a lot. I spent many years living and working in Senegal, West Africa. And this organization is called Tostan, which in the local language of Wolof means to break open, like an egg. It started with a woman who was traveling for her college trip. So similar to a lot of you when you go on a journey and you go to a new country and you go on this exchange program and you get off the plane and the air smells different, the light looks different, the people are speaking a language you don't understand, and you're excited to be there. She started this journey in Senegal and looking at the people and the kids and wondering why they were all reading French children's books when they spoke a different language. They spoke a local language, an indigenous African language. But the colonial influence, the French colonial influence in Senegal, made it that all of the kids' books were in French. She thought, that's kind of silly. Well, let's just create other books. Her organization grew and grew and grew into a point where now she has working in 17 different countries around the world empowering women and girls and communities to think about democratic governance, human rights, environmental sustainability, and most importantly, really focuses on doing all of that through this idea that education is the most important component. And adult education, non-formal adult education. What does that mean? It means, as Paulo Freire said in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you bring people together and you allow them to engender their own knowledge from their experiences. And so that's what Tostan does. And Tostan actually works very closely with local villages to convince the chiefs of these villages and the imams, because it's a Muslim country. Most of West Africa and the French-speaking part is. And so you get these imams and these chief of villages to understand for the first time why female genital cutting, taking that agency and that right of girls away from them, is wrong. And they signed declarations, and it's now illegal. And how did it start? It started because Tostan started a conversation. They started discussing whether or not it was actually written in the Quran. It's not. Whether or not it was actually a part of indigenous rights. It's not. And all you needed to do is start the conversation. But respecting the local culture, it had to be a decision by the chief of the villages and the imams. And she knew that. And the communities know that. And the women know what's best for their communities. So it's an example of social entrepreneurship because although it's not a profit-making business, and it has some earned income revenue, but not a lot. It relies on a lot of donations. But it's a model where the power of the solution came from a long committed process of dialogue and engagement with information, knowledge, and resources coming from the local population. And this is a really important example of where organizations that start very simple with their own resources can have transformational change. I'm going to give you another example, One Acre Fund. One Acre Fund is in Kenya. And they actually work in several East African countries, founded by Andrew Yoon. He went to Kenya with his friend John from Rwanda, and they asked a very simple question. With 2/3 of the world relying on rain-fed agriculture, and the majority of those people, women, working in farms with no inputs, in precarious positions, how can we solve that problem? How might we actually do it right? What do you think the solution is? Really simple. It was these 4 things: financing for farmer inputs, distribution of seeds, training, and market facilitation. No grandiose new product innovation, just doing what needs to be done more efficiently. And doing it with the farmers themselves. So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to try to wrap up a little bit, which is hard, because I have a lot of things I want to share. But one of them is that measuring social impact in social enterprises is probably one thing that I really hope you walk away from today. In all of the work that you do, in all of the organizations that you work with, if you're not measuring what impact you're making, it means you're probably making a bad one. So you need to ask questions. What are the impacts of our actions? What are the impacts of what we're buying and putting into this company, into this hotel, into this business? And what are the impacts of using it? And how are we going to measure it? What are the best indicators? What are the metrics that we want to hold ourselves accountable to? And then, how much does it cost to collect that information? And what do we do with it? And that's the beginning of social enterprises. That's how they start. But I also think it's how we want to live in the world, is conscious of the impacts of our actions. And the reason it's important is because there's very weak data on actually what impacts there are on women and girls when we don't pay attention. Because many of the largest shifts in GDP actually arise from valuing what we consider intangible assets, like giving women childcare, giving women basic access to education, safe transportation, right? We can quantify them after we do it, but often they're intangible assets in our initial analyses. And entrepreneurship is really important. It creates industries and business opportunities and environments where people can create innovations and change the society. But we need to create jobs that solve systemic problems. We need to create solutions that solve systemic problems. And to do that, you need to have a theory of change. What is the theory that says, if I do something different, I might actually get at this problem? I might see a change. And those are some thoughts that we have a lot in social entrepreneurship that I think would be useful for you as well. So looking ahead to challenges and opportunities, I'm going to leave this Hirschman quote aside, although it's an important one. And I'm just going to leave you with sort of 3 questions and some final remarks. And the first is, what is social enterprise and social entrepreneurship besides just doing well by doing good? And the reason that question is important is because we all have to ask ourselves, what does doing good actually mean? What do we mean by doing good? What is good to us? Is good to us how someone else feels? If someone else is living a better life, is that good for me? So asking ourselves how we define good. And then on the empirical level, where do profits and sustainability converge and then contest each other? And then on a theoretical and policy level, we ask ourselves, is there a limit to what markets can do in terms of turning social problems into business opportunities? How far can our moral imagination go? How far can it take us? And the reason that we ask that question is because, as I showed you in that earlier slide, there is a huge distrust in government and in institutions in general. And yet, if we rely on markets, knowing there are important limits to them, then what do we fall onto? What do we rely on? What are the social institutions and structures that we can rely on? And we need to build them. So these are just some more details on these questions that I was going to cover. But I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to go to my final reflection. Critical observations, the push for impact measurement, which champions market-based solutions, sometimes masks the messy political struggles inherent in institutional change. Other critical observations are that social enterprise models themselves presume win-win solutions despite evidence of deep market failure. And we have some major struggles to do to find the right kinds of models in different contexts where we can solve social problems and at the same time redirect market forces. And then social entrepreneurship has become a proxy for uncertainty in a world of economic and climate crises. And I would ask all of you who are thinking about entrepreneurship and starting businesses and working in your companies that you're going to work for, in society in general, that you want to be careful that some of the most important things that you're going to be working on are aspects of a society that no one has solutions for. There are no solutions for a lot of the things that we're facing. And so in light of that, you need to allow yourself to ask better questions. And in asking better questions, we get to understand the difference between solving a problem with a lawnmower versus scissors. Some problems require lawnmowers, some problems require scissors. Details and massive change. There are really exciting trends in the world in social entrepreneurship, really exciting trends. In Ecuador, I think you have a very exciting movement of social entrepreneurs and social enterprises that are leading the way, and I encourage you to look them up and to partner with them. In the United States, we have really exciting movements on the legal front. We have benefit corporations and B Corps, where businesses are choosing to embed the values in the actual business charters. And we have growing social capital markets. We have the Gates Foundation loan guarantees. We've got different financial vehicles that are helping people, everyday people like you and I, channel our money into making the world a better place, where we channel it into organizations that are measuring their impact, that are committed to communities. Every single day we purchase something, we're making a statement. Imagine if we could make great statements for good every single time we make a purchase. What a world. There are so many opportunities. So I'm going to end with just a couple of thoughts, and that is that be explicit about what we value. We all have faith in something. Some people have faith in divine grace. Some people have faith in science. Some people have faith in humans, in nature, and animals. Whatever you have faith in, be explicit about it. The world needs explicit values. We need to live our values out loud. And I'd also encourage you to look at the long-term strategic impacts of your work, wherever you work. Hold yourself accountable to them. Become part of this creative wave of positive, forward-thinking, problem-solving social entrepreneurs. And lastly, to exist humanly is to name the world and therefore to change it. Thank you for your attention. I really appreciate it. Thanks.